I'm Teisha Bader, and in the news, the Temple Mount, the site that is holy to Jews and Muslims in Jerusalem's Old City, which is once again a flashpoint of conflict and violence. This highly tense and highly sensitive situation often repeats itself around this time during the holy Muslim month of Ramadan, which this year also coincides with Passover. But what other factors contribute to this very complex issue? Well, to help us understand is Dr. Eran Tzidkiyahu from the Center for International Studies at the Paris Institute of Political Sciences. Eran is also a research associate at the Forum for Regional Thinking, an independent, nonpartisan Jewish and Arab research institute and think tank dedicated to the fundamental political and social issues. His work focusing on religious nationalism and sacred spaces in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Eran joins us now from Jerusalem. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Tisha.
So before we get into what's happening today, can you just give us a little bit of history, of background as to why this site often spirals into this kind of conflict?
Well, we all remember the Temple Mount usually when violence breaks out, but actually it is an issue that has been going on for about 100 years. The conflict, as we know it, between Jews and Arabs in the Holy Land started around the Temple Mount and the holy sites in Jerusalem during holy times. And it started as a violent conflict between two national movements about 100 years ago in 1920, in April 1920. So you can see that already 100 years ago, the Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa Mosque, holy times, holy days, national religious significance in holy places like the old city of Jerusalem and the surroundings of the holy site, the holy esplanade itself, the Temple Mount or Al-Aqsa Mosque, depending from where you look at it, has been actually if I use superlative here, the nuclear reactor generating violence or translating tensions to violence from the very beginning of the Jewish-Arab conflict into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Since the 1990s and the peace process, the holy sites, mainly in Jerusalem, but also in Hebron, has been maybe the spatial arena around which tensions were time and again translated to violence around, again, the same pattern, holy times and holy places, in a way that actually contributed dramatically to the collapse of the peace process and a political change. The Al-Aqsa Intifada in 2000, which started on the Temple Mount. And I can go on and on to 2015 and the knife intifada, the stabbing intifada that started in Jerusalem around the Al-Aqsa Temple Mount. 2017, the metal detectors, 19, of course, last year, right, that started a wave of intercommunal violence all over the country and the war with Hamas. So, of course, the Temple Mount is not the deep reason there is a whole territorial, political, historical conflict going on between Jews and Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians, but it is the place that provokes the violence, and it is the spatial arena where violence erupts. So this is a pattern that it is worth noticing, and because it repeats itself time and again.
Yes, so this pattern that you speak of, how do we stop it? Is there a way to sort of pinpoint a first step, a first action, something that happens, and then the rest sort of escalates from there? Can you find that one or two things? I know it sounds oversimplified, but is there a way to sort of stop it or approach it in a different way so it doesn't get to this point?
Well, I think we should first try and understand why it is happening this way. And then maybe we can start dismantling this explosive site. Zionism and we have to start in the beginning for a moment, so I'm going to make it short, but Zionism is the Jewish national movement. It is based on the word Zion. Zion is not only a place mentioned in the Bible, the temple, Jerusalem, or the land of Israel, or in different variations, the people of Israel. It is also a concept coming back to Israel, gathering the Jews, establishing Jewish kingdom, sovereignty, a state, and building a temple and sacrificing animals in the temple to live according to the word of God. And up until Zionism, nothing less was returning to Zion. Zionism came along, secularized the theologically charged term Zion, and named the Jewish national movement after this idea of returning to Zion. It's a pattern that was forged in the first exile. And the return to Zion, the Jews came back, built the temple, of course, established the state and built the temple. And this was what Jews prayed for 2,000 years. And all of a sudden, these Jewish nationalists come along, establish a state, gather the Jews, build the state, and then they build the university and they build the kibbutz, but they don't build the temple. They were alienated by the concept. They were secular. The idea of Zion, though, reflects the inherent tension within Zionism between religion and the modern secular idea of nationalism. Now, Palestinian nationalism was also based on the secularized religious ethos of the sanctity of Jerusalem and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Quran says, سبحان الذي أسرى بعبده ليلا من المسجد الحرام إلى المسجد الأقصى الذي باركنا حوله, which means, blessed be God that drove his servant, the Prophet Muhammad, by night from the holy place in Mecca, the Holy Mosque, to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the far distant mosque, the environments of which we have blessed. So the Holy Land, the promised land for the Jews, is the blessed land in the Quran. And the blessing is received because of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It bestows the blessing on the land. And the whole local identity of the Levant was established around the sanctity of Jerusalem. And many years later, after the Crusades were banished from the Holy Land by Saladin, the idea of the sanctity of Jerusalem and the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the mission of the local Muslims in this country, and I'm talking about 800 years ago, to protect it from the foreign takeover, became the fundamentals of the local identity, which later, many years later, become the bedrock upon which the foundations of the Palestinian national movement will be laid upon. And from the very beginning, 100 years ago, a dialogue was conducted between Zionists and Palestinians around the question of the Temple Mount and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Chaim Arlozorov, which was the foreign minister of the Zionist movement, tried to explain to the Muslims, to Haj Amin al-Husseini, at the time leader of the Palestinian national movement in the early 30s, we are not interested in building a temple. And the Mufti, which was a religious clerk and the leader of the Palestinian national movement at the time, answered to him and said, we don't believe you because we read your scriptures. You will not stop at the wall. You will take another step. Now, we all know that the Western Wall is only the external edifice of the Temple Mount. Take one more step and you're on the Temple Mount, meaning you will take ownership and sovereignty. So there is an existential fear from the very beginning of the Palestinian national movement that the Zionist movement is eventually based on religious ideas, and its end goal, the end point of Zion, as one scholar wrote an article titled, is to establish a temple on the ruins of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the basic justification for Palestinian identity. And
so does this boil down to mistrust at the end of the day? If Israel keeps saying, we're going to maintain the status quo, we'll maintain freedom of worship, but the Palestinians and certainly the terror group Hamas keep saying, no, they're going to do this, they're going to take it, you have to protect it. Is that at the
So
at the
I
core?
think that there is a very deep misunderstanding. Many Israelis say that it is a plot, it is a lie. Palestinians know that Israel is not aiming at building a temple. And many Palestinians are completely convinced that there is an ongoing plan to diminish Muslim rights at the site. The model of many Muslim Palestinians, and of course, the minority in the Israeli society of temple activists, is the Hebron Mosques. At the moment, what happened in Hebron is that after the Goldstein massacre, when a Jewish nationalist, religious extremist, killed 29 worshippers in 1994 in Purim and Ramadan, Israel changed the order in the mosque and the cave of Machpelah in Hebron and divided the space between Jews and Muslims. Not only divided the space, but also divided times. So there's separate times for Muslims and Jews to use the entire area. And Palestinians keep expressing a fear that Israel is going to divide the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Temple Mount, the Holy Esplanade, like it did in Hebron. It is, of course, not the Israeli policy, not the government, but some small groups they were much more marginal in the 1990s. In the last decade, they've become stronger, but they're still not dictating the Israeli policy. They talk also about dividing times and dividing space, like in Hebron. So there is a fear. Now, it is, of course, not the divider that was placed in the Western Wall in 1929, or the metal detectors in 2017, or the fences in Damascus Gate last year that are the deep cause for violence. Nobody cares about a fence or any mundane object. It is the meaning beneath the actions. Of course, it is the idea of who belongs here, who owns this place, to whom. It's deep questions of really of belonging, of autochthony, who is the native here, right? And yes, a lot of mistrust. If I may, I want to add that when we are asking about how to stop the violence around the Temple Mount, we have to take into consideration that the Temple Mount is a small space. It's about 133 dunam, so translated to acre, I think it's about 40 acre, if I'm not mistaken. And it is, of course, impossible to separate what's happening on the mountain from what's happening around the mountain or the mount. The power balance outside the Holy Esplanade prevents Palestinians from being able to concede to or to agree to more rights for Jewish worshippers. They feel that this is, let's say, the last stronghold that they are holding. And outside the Holy Esplanade, in East Jerusalem, in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, of course, in the entire context of the Israeli-Palestinian Jewish-Arab relations, they are the weak side. And they still have some power, the threat of a violent eruption in the Holy Esplanade. And it is very hard for them to concede. For Israelis, as long as Palestinians don't recognize their right to the Temple Mount, I'm not even talking about worshiping rights, right? Just the fact that there was a temple, for example, and that it is a site holy to Israeli Jews, etc. It means that they are negating our mere existence. So it feels like there is an ongoing dialogue between, in Hebrew we say, dialogue shel chalshim, dialogue between two deaf people that cannot hear each other. And I think we first need to understand this and the context that we cannot really solve the problems on the mountain without relating to the power balance outside, but we cannot also, as we've learned in the 1990s, really change the power balance outside without being giving very close attention to what's going on the Holy Mountain itself. Yeah, so there is what we call a dialectic, a complex dialectic relations here.
It's very complex, as you say. It's truly, it sounds almost impossible. I don't want to be pessimistic about it. I always have hope that things can be somehow worked out or improved. But in the meantime, Israel is responding in the way that it feels it has to. For example, when just a few days ago. And even just this morning, Palestinian riders went inside Al-Aqsa, threw firecrackers, threw rocks. And, there have been instances where Israeli police forces have been forced to go in, which is seen as a grave violation, not just by the Palestinians, but by Israel's Arab neighbors and Arab nations. But what do you do in that instance when there is violence, when there is, rocks being thrown as far as where the Western Wall is? So, you don't really have a choice but to respond and protect and defend human life in that instance. But then, as we're seeing now, that brings condemnation from Jordan, very strong condemnation, and even from the United Arab Emirates, who just signed the Abraham Accords with Israel. So in this situation right now, is there a different way a different kind of response that you see that is possible? Yes,
I think so. First of all, I think Israel should have been more prepared. And it was, I think, that the first entry of the police in Friday morning to the mosque should have been prevented, because the risk of entering and maybe killing a protester and could start a cycle of violence. Maybe the risk of damaging the mosque, maybe setting fire to the mosque by mistake, right? And there's enough means to contain the violence on the second Friday of Ramadan, yes, or when the priestly blessing is about to begin. It is a very tense moment. We had a moment like this in October 1990. Israel ended up killing 17 Palestinians on the Temple Mount, and it was a disaster, not only a tragedy and a loss of life, but also a disaster to the Israeli interest and to the Israeli-American relations in the time when the United States tried to establish a coalition to invade Iraq and recruit the Arab states. So the Temple Mount can be used against Israel as a stumbling block to its regional relations, to international relations. When the first time that American and Israeli interests started to shift away from each other was when Israel killed 17 Muslims on the Temple Mount during a Jewish holiday. It was also due to a threat posed by a very marginal group in Israel. It was at the time the Temple Mount faithful. This time it's Chozrim Lahar, coming back to the mountain. It's very small groups who dictate policy to an entire state. And I think that there are enough ways that we could have, or enough means or preventional measures that Israel could have taken in advance, including approaching the Palestinian leadership in East Jerusalem in the street, not addressing them by the president, the young Shabab, the youth in East Jerusalem, not listen to the Israeli president. You need to approach to them through local leaders. You need to approach to them in the streets, in the gates of the Holy Esplanade. You can also contain some of the violence inside. You can create some kind of a net. We have to, of course, see the site itself to protect the worshippers in the Western Wall that are just below, yes, the plaza. If you are on the plaza at a certain point and you throw a stone, it can hurt people praying in the Temple Mount, in the Western Wall. And you can create some more physical measures to protect worshippers, and this way contain the violence on the site, push them into the structures inside, and prevent from bursting in with a lot of power, a lot of force that might cause an escalation. This is actually, it is not being weak, it is being wise and not playing into the hands of radicals that actually want to see an escalation.
And that's the other thing that I wanted to just ask you about was we're hearing from terror group Hamas, go, mobilize, do what you can. You have to defend Al-Aqsa. You have to protect Al-Aqsa. Hamas has an interest in restarting even greater conflict with Israel. Is that fair to say?
Well, within Hamas, there are different voices. I think that Sinwar in Gaza doesn't want to intervene. I'm not sure that he sees it as is an interest. But other voices within Hamas, especially more external voices that are not in Gaza now at the moment, are pushing for Hamas intervention. I can tell you that last year, after the cancellation of the elections in the PA, just days before the escalation started, Hamas put a lot of hope in the elections. And when the elections were canceled, it was stuck. And all of a sudden, the violence in Jerusalem was an excellent opportunity for Hamas to, let's say, reinvent itself outside the political game through violence. And all of a sudden, shooting rockets into Jerusalem during the Jerusalem flag parade, the Jerusalem Day parade, the flag dance, as we call it, labeled Hamas as the protector of Jerusalem and made it the most popular movement in the territories. So sometimes escalation might play into the hands of Hamas. And we have to also take into consideration that Hamas has different voices, and Hamas doesn't want to jeopardize the political achievements it made in Gaza. It is practically the strongest and most popular movement in the territories, and it is also a quasi-state already in Gaza, and it doesn't want to jeopardize it. But when it sees a chance to escalate the conflict around holy places, religious ideas, this kind of escalation, religiously oriented or national religious oriented escalation, strengthened Hamas, of course.
Lastly, we just have a quick minute. In the situation that Israel is in right now, so there could have been more done, you're saying, but looking at how things are right now, is there a way to shift the trajectory slightly so that Israel does not end up in an even more difficult and with even more conflict?
These are difficult questions. We are talking about 1 square kilometer surrounded by what President Clinton called it the Holy Basin, or it was a term coined around that time, the Clinton parameters. The Holy Basin is the geographical area around the old city. It's a very small area, and it is one of the most complex places in the world, I think, with religious, national, historical, cultural significances condensed one on top of the other. This kind of area needs special treatment. It needs a lot of attention. It needs experts. It needs a forum of religious clergy. It needs a much more delicate treatment and approach than how I think Israel is treating or using or applying in this area today. And indeed, many radicals, by the way, not only in the Palestinian side, but also in the Israeli Jewish side, it is only natural for them to mobilize religious and national religious feelings and holy places to their own ends. And let's say the majority and the state institutions and the moderate majority needs to pay more attention to these places and demand a more intelligent and delicate treatment. Without going into the details, I think police work is hard and complicated and important, but it cannot sum up with policing. Police
Eran.
is like a hammer, and every problem looks to them like a nail. And we need smarter, more delicate approach and more complex actions that are taking into consideration all the different aspects.
Eran, thank you so much. I truly hope that we can talk. We can see better days ahead. That things do calm down, and we look forward to having you back on JBS whenever possible. Dr. Eran Tzidkiyahu is from the Center for International Studies at the Paris Institute of Political Sciences and a research associate at the Forum for Regional Thinking. Thank you, Eran, so much for joining us here on JBS.
Thank you. Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach. And thank you, as always, to our director, Sloan Copeland, JBS Managing Director Dara Golub, Technical Manager Michael Paley, Transmission Manager John McDevitt, and our producer Carol Lilienthal. And thank you for watching In the News. Be well.